Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, The Package Tourist, and the magical mystery tour called life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author Dr. Paul Kahan. Paul lives in the greater Philadelphia area and is an expert in 19th century U.S. history and has more than a decade's experience in administering museums and allied nonprofit organizations. Paul has written 7 books dealing with a wide variety of topics like the Homestead Strike, the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Simon Cameron, Abraham Lincoln's first Secretary of War, and Andrew Jackson's battle with the Second Bank of the United States. Tonight, we will discuss Paul Kahan's latest release, Philadelphia, A Narrative History. Paul, welcome to the show. It's a great honor and privilege to have you here. And I'd like to
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. Paul, I want to ask, my first question is this. What led you to write about the city of Philadelphia, and how long did it take for you to write the book?
So that's a great question. You gave a brief introduction about my work, and I think if there's one thread that really connects most of my work, it's an interest in the history of Pennsylvania. Whether it's the Homestead Strike in Pittsburgh or the bank war here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania has had a really interesting history, and so having gone to graduate school in Philadelphia at Temple and having grown up in the Delaware Valley, I thought I was intimately familiar with the history of Philadelphia. And of course, the standard history of Philadelphia was Russ Weigley's magisterial Philadelphia, a 300-year history. But that book is 42 years old at this point, and it really was beginning to show its age. In addition, each of the chapters was written by a different historian, so you get a very uneven focus chapter to chapter. And I just thought that given that it had been 40-plus years, and that I had some interesting thoughts about the history of the city of Philadelphia, I thought, why not? And when I pitched the book to the University of Pennsylvania Press, my editor was delighted. He told me that he had been waiting decades for someone to pitch a new single-volume history of the city of Philadelphia. So I took that as a particularly good sign, a green flag, as the kids today say. And it took me 8.5 years to write the book, which is a very long time. It's the longest time I spent writing any of my previous books. So there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in those pages.
Fantastic, Paul. Paul, after all that 8 years of superhuman research, in your opinion, what separates Philadelphia from other notable U.S. cities like Boston or New York, Chicago or San Francisco or any other major U.S. city?
That's a really interesting question. It's one that I get a lot. And on the one hand, I think that the history of the city of Philadelphia is a really good way to tell the history of urban America. Because so many of the challenges and the themes that we see in the history of cities play out in the city of Philadelphia. One of the themes of my book is anti-urbanism and the role that disdain for urban life and cities has played in the development of Philadelphia. And you could really write a book about anti-urbanism in New York or anti-urbanism in Boston or anti-urbanism in Chicago. I mean, there's a lot of resonance in that theme to those other cities. At the same time, Philadelphia is a unique place with its own unique character and its own unique development. For instance, it's one of the few cities in the United States that is coterminous with a county. There aren't many other cities that are the size of a county. Los Angeles comes to mind. But because of that, because of the sheer size of the city and the fact that it takes on the trappings of both county and city government, you have some really unique challenges that have shaped the way the city has developed. And of course, no city is more closely associated with the history of the American Revolution, for better or for worse, as I make clear in the book, than the city of Philadelphia. And I think that connection adds a really unique flavor to the history of Philadelphia that's not present in the history of those other cities.
Okay. Now, you anticipate my next question. How significant was Philadelphia's central location during America's colonial history in making the city of Philadelphia a locus for the American Revolution and also the early years of the American Republic?
So it's location is incredibly important. And, one of the things that I like to remind folks when they read the book is that Philadelphia didn't just happen. It didn't just appear at random. It was planned and planted and cultivated very self-consciously. When William Penn founded the colony of Pennsylvania, he knew that he needed a mercantile city to export all of the rich produce produced by the colony to Great Britain. And so Philadelphia, when he founded the colony, Philadelphia didn't grow organically. It was designed to be a mercantile city. Okay. And that's incredibly important. That location on the Delaware is incredibly important, and that location in the mid-Atlantic, providing a connection between the colonies of the South and the colonies of the North, makes it the obvious location from a geographic standpoint for the meeting place during the colonial period, and then, of course, during the capital of the United States. But it's also Philadelphia's unique cultural, economic, and political place in the colonies that really sets it apart. Philadelphia is the second largest and second most important city in the British Empire at the outbreak of the American War for Independence. And I want to say that again. Not the second largest and most important city in North America. It is the second largest and most important city in the British Empire. So, when Franklin is in London, he's kind of messing around doing some mathematical tables, and he calculates that if the population of North America continues growing at the rate that it was, that eventually the center of gravity of the British Empire would shift to North America just by dint of there being more English-speaking folks in North America than in Great Britain. And the center of that would be Philadelphia. So Philadelphia has an incredibly important political, economic, cultural, and psychological role beyond just its location, which makes it an absolutely ideal place for colonial government in the period of the American Revolution and then the early Republic.
Paul, when you were doing your research and writing this book, what was the biggest surprise you discovered?
Oh, my God. Well, there are so many. I mean, if you read the introduction of the book, at several points, I say this in the introduction, I'm a professional historian. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I grew up in the Philadelphia region, and every single chapter I discovered something where I said, I never knew that. I, for instance, never knew that Philadelphia was the Athens of America in the 19th century, that it had the same cultural and economic influence as New York and Los Angeles combined do today. It's such an important city throughout the early part of the 19th century, up until the end of the Civil War, and we just don't talk about that. And one of the reasons we don't talk about that is because the legacy of the American Revolution has overshadowed a lot of that really important history. I think to our detriment, because Philadelphia becomes a place that you go to learn about the Revolution, have a cheesesteak, and go home. And we don't celebrate that unique and important history that in many ways has laid the groundwork for the present that the city faces and the challenges that the city faces today. So there are tons of surprises woven throughout the book, and I would invite your listeners to take a look. I think they'll be pleasantly surprised.
Now, when you were doing your research and writing, does your book debunk any type of preconceived myths about Philadelphia in any way, shape, or form?
Not really. I mean, I think it definitely adds a lot of nuance and color to the story that people know. Everyone knows that William Penn was a Quaker, and he came to Pennsylvania and founded Pennsylvania as a religious refuge, and that's part of the story. But another part of the story is the economic role. Penn was trying to redeem the family fortune by founding Pennsylvania, and religious tolerance was not only good from a moral perspective, it was good from a business perspective because it encouraged folks to come to Pennsylvania. And of course, the jewel in that crown was Philadelphia. And so not only do you have these very idealistic reasons for the colony and the location of Philadelphia and the founding of Philadelphia, but you also have these really pragmatic economic interests at work. And that placement of the city on the Delaware makes the city a maritime city in a way that I don't think we quite think of it today, because we have a very different relationship to seas and rivers and ocean travel. In the 18th and the 19th century, this was the economic lifeblood of cities and North America. And, the role that the Delaware played in the city's development is incredibly important, and I think has been kind of overshadowed in the 20th century. We built roads, we expanded transportation hubs, and we moved away from shipping as playing a really important central role, and I think lost that history when we did it.
Okay. Based on your research, Paul, who do you think was the most underrated significant figure or figures in Philadelphia municipal history?
Yeah, my goodness, that's the question that I've been dreading, because it's so hard to pick one person, right? I mean, the first published anti-slavery petition appears in Germantown in 1688. The first abolition society in North America is founded in Philadelphia. And, most of these folks that I might mention who were leaders in this, many of your listeners would have no idea who William White was, or, Benjamin Rush, these incredibly important figures who play a really important role in many of the social movements that improve people's lives in the 19th century and the 20th century. Philadelphia plays an incredibly important symbolic role in the women's rights movement and in the abolitionist movement. And so it really becomes a symbol that folks like Frederick Douglass can rally around in an attempt to improve the lot of enslaved people in North America. And it attracts an unbelievable cast of characters. I had no idea that Samuel Clemens, who's probably better known to your listeners by his pen name, Mark Twain, lived here in Philadelphia briefly and worked at the newspaper that became the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Wow.
So on some level, he was a Philadelphia guy, even though, of course, he's associated with the Mississippi. He spent some time here in the city of Philadelphia. I mean, it's really quite wild. Charles Dickens visited the city twice and wrote really scathing things about Eastern State Penitentiary. So, again, as I said earlier, I think that there are a lot of surprises in the book, and it would be hard to pick one underrated figure or figures in Philadelphia's municipal history.
In your opinion, Paul, who is Philadelphia's most leading cultural and artistic figure?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, probably you're gonna have to go with someone like Benjamin Franklin, who is a polymath, who has an incredibly important and enduring role in American culture. I would invite anyone who hasn't read them to read his autobiography, which is a study in myth making, but it's delightfully charming, and so it's definitely worth picking up a copy. But Philadelphia plays an incredibly important role in American culture. Early radio takes place here. The television is developed here. The first electro computer, the ENIAC, is developed here. So all of these things that in the 20th and the 21st centuries play such an incredibly important role in shaping American culture have very, very deep roots here in the city of Philadelphia. There was a motion picture industry here. There was a black motion picture industry here. And of course, there was a music industry here. Your listeners who are old enough will probably remember Dick Clark and American Bandstand. That was filmed here in the city of Philadelphia early on. And part of the reason why it was filmed here was because Philadelphia was synonymous with a broad range of music and, rock and roll and the blues and jazz and all of this stuff. Not for nothing, it was Larry Kane, who was a Philadelphia newscaster who follows the Beatles around in the 1960s and does reporting early in their career. So, Philadelphia really plays this incredibly important cultural part of America's cultural landscape. A lot of that geography is Philadelphia.
Yeah, look at Live Aid, 1985.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, Live Aid. Yeah. Okay, when the Industrial Revolution began taking hold in America, what was Philadelphia's leading industry during the expansion of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century?
So that's a really interesting question. So, Pennsylvania sits on some of the largest deposits of coal in the world. And that, of course, made Pennsylvania one of the leading industrial centers in the first the United States and really in the world. So as a result, this fuel that's powering the Industrial Revolution is being dug out of the ground here in Pennsylvania. And so that spurs the creation of factories, and that spurs the creation of steam-powered machines. In addition, iron smelting and then steel production goes back nearly to the founding of Pennsylvania, because, of course, there are iron ore deposits here in Pennsylvania. So you really have the two most important elements of the Industrial Revolution right here: the power in terms of the coal and the raw materials in terms of iron ore. And so Pennsylvania becomes an industrial giant in the 19th century. And that gives it political and economic clout. For most of the 19th century, Pennsylvania has the second highest number of electoral votes. You could not win the presidency without winning Pennsylvania. And so as a result, there was a lot of concentrated wealth that gets, kind of spilt into other industries, like the railroads. Pennsylvania has an incredibly important role in railroad development. I mean, many of the locomotives that you see in museums today were manufactured in Philadelphia at the Baldwin Locomotive Factory. And that the Pennsylvania Railroad ends up controlling the state government in a lot of very unfortunate ways, and the city government in a lot of very unfortunate ways. So, Philadelphia or Pennsylvania is really a leader in that early stage of the Industrial Revolution. And it's really when the forms of electricity generation and power generation and the types of manufacturing become a little bit more sophisticated in the 20th century, and the country has expanded westward, that moves west, first to places like Michigan and then later to California. But in the 19th century, Philadelphia is on the cutting edge of industrial production, and as a result, Philadelphia is on the cutting edge of industrial production in the United States.
Okay. Paul, in your opinion, who was the most controversial figure in Philadelphia city history?
Well, without a doubt, that's Rizzo. And
Yeah.
Rizzo was, Rizzo has his supporters, although they are few and far between, and mostly dying off. Rizzo was called the worst big city mayor by, I believe, the Journal of Political Science in the 20th century. And, I think that, he really became the face of racist backlash politics, deservedly. And, he had the good fortune of being mayor at a point where the federal government was still giving cities significant financial support. It's really, beginning in the late 1970s with the adoption of neoliberal economics that the federal government basically says, we're not doing that anymore. And of course, there's this famous New York Daily News front page when the Ford administration refuses to bail out New York, Ford the city dropped dead. And that was really in many ways the beginning of the end of the New Deal and the New Deal economic support that created a very strong middle class and provided the funding that made possible really good municipal services. And in many ways, cities have not recovered, Philadelphia being one of them, from, the end of those types of supports. And neoliberalism has been devastating to cities throughout the United States, but it's been devastating to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Rizzo, the softness, the fondness that a certain subset of Philadelphians have for Rizzo has a lot to do with the fact that he had federal dollars to play with that his successors did not. And a lot of the fondness they have for him is just flat-out racism.
Yeah.
And, I certainly cheered the removal of the Rizzo statue from the Municipal Services Building, which was not paid for by the city. It had been, funded by friends of Rizzo, but it was on city property, and I'm certainly glad that it has disappeared. I hope it's at the bottom of the Delaware, but it is at the moment. It is at the moment in an undisclosed location, probably in Dick Cheney's bunker.
Paul, in Europe, now let's get to politics now, Philadelphia city politics. In your opinion, who was the greatest mayor in Philadelphia municipal history in terms of impacting the political, social, cultural, and architectural landscape?
Oh, that's a really tough question. Probably and I'm going to say this hesitantly, I will always finger the worst. Fingering the best is really kind of difficult. Probably Dilworth and Clark, that team in the 1950s and the 1960s. But, they had they were very, very fortunate in that, it was a period of economic prosperity. There was a lot of tax revenue. There was a lot of federal government revenue. And it was a period where there was a lot of confidence in government to solve problems. And, I think that those things came together and made it possible for them to do big things in a way that, had they been living in another era, would not have been possible. And, it's funny because, municipal government has always been dodgy in Philadelphia for a lot of reasons that I lay out in the book.
Yeah.
And in the 18th century, one of the fundraising things that the city did was pass an ordinance that if you refused to serve as mayor, you would be fined. And then they'd elect someone mayor. That person would inevitably refuse to serve, and they would fine them. And it became such an important part of balancing the budget that they did this knowing what they were doing. I was born in 1980. I grew up in the 1990s and the 2000s, where people were going to prison to become mayor of Philadelphia. These guys were going to prison to avoid being mayor of Philadelphia, which is kind of a wild thing to think about. But I think it gives you a sense of the challenges of that office.
Okay.
I'll say, look, I'm going to ruin some people's days here, but I think that it's a tough job, and I think that the people who end up getting it don't have much in the way of vision. And I think that we tend to lionize folks like Ed Rendell, who, if you've read that chapter in the book,
yeah,
was not a particularly great mayor for most of the city of Philadelphia. Really leaned in that sort of New Democrat way on neoliberalism. And as a result, Center City looked great, but if you lived anywhere else, things were not so great. Okay. And, so I think that, again, it's a lot easier to pick losers than it is to pick winners.
Now, Paul, I've always been curious about this. Please explain to our listeners why the Republican Party had a stranglehold on the mayoralty from 1884 until 1951, and then after 1951, a new stranglehold by the Democrats. They've had a stranglehold on the mayoralty ever since 1951. Why? Okay, explain both strangleholds. Okay,
Sure.
What happened?
Sure.
Okay.
So to understand that, you need to understand how transformative the American Civil War was politically.
Yeah.
The Republican Party comes out of nowhere in the early 1850s. You're getting the collapse of the Whig Party. The Democratic Party is just it's losing its mind. It's being split. The Democratic Party in the 19th century was two fundamentally irreconcilable groups. Industrial workers in the North and slave owners in the South. And they don't have much in common except they hate the same groups of people. And what coalesces as the Whig Party is everybody who's not a Democrat. So these are very, very tense connections that are really defined by who you aren't rather than who you are. And the Whig Party collapses in the 1850s. And as a result, once that begins cracking up, the bonds holding the Democratic Party begin cracking up, and it really just collapses. And that's what makes it possible for Abraham Lincoln to become president in 1860. There are four people that run for president in 1860. Lincoln does not win a majority of the vote, but he gets more of the vote than anyone else, and he becomes president of the United States. The Civil War provides an opportunity for the Republicans to consolidate their control in Congress because most of the Democrats leave. And the Republicans are very, very smart about that. They use that control of Congress to institutionalize their power. And then the fight after the Civil War Reconstruction, where they slowly begin letting southern states in, southern states being, initially controlled by Republican governments that are imposed at gunpoint. And then eventually, slowly they get taken over by the Southern Democrats. But the Republicans make sure that they're always in control. And, they actually create North and South Dakota, God help us, to ensure their control in the Senate. So there's a lot of this political manipulation going on. Going into the Civil War, the Democrats controlled Center City, Philadelphia, and the Whigs controlled sort of outlying areas, your Fairmount, your Southworks, all those places. Because of Philadelphia's importance, the Republican Party during the war places a lot of emphasis on consolidating its power. And anyone who's walked down Broad Street and sees the Union League sees a tangible symbol of that consolidation. Mm-hmm. And so coming out of the war, the Democratic Party is destroyed. The Whigs no longer exist. The Republicans are basically the only game in town. And they've been running the city. And they've won the war, right? You know, the Democrats are traitors. The Republicans remind that every single chance they get. And they create a political machine that rewards its supporters through patronage and through jobs and contracts and all that stuff. And that machine works very, very effectively. There's a state-level Republican machine controlled by Simon Cameron, who, incidentally, I wrote the first biography of in 60 years.
Yep.
And you know, there's sort of a baby machine in Philadelphia that controls Philadelphia. And Cameron's political machine controls the state of Pennsylvania until the New Deal. It is the longest lived Republican machine in the United States. Most of the other Republican machines collapse well before the New Deal. Cameron's collapses in the late 1930s.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's incredible. So Pennsylvania is a Republican state, you know, into the New Deal. And what basically breaks the back of the Republican Party is the fact that it doesn't have an answer to the Depression, right? You know, the Hoover administration just founders. And there's some efforts on the state level. There's some state-level Republicans, but of course they're not getting much support from the Hoover administration. And that paves the way for FDR to win the presidency in 1932. And the New Deal becomes very, very political. It becomes thoroughly identified with the Democrats, and people like what they're seeing. And as a result, you begin getting people fleeing the Republican Party and becoming Democrats. The lone holdouts tend to be black folks. But once Truman desegregates the Army in 1948 and makes a commitment, tepid as it is, to civil rights, you begin losing a core constituency of the Republican Party. And so it should come as no surprise that, you know, a couple of years later, you get the breaking of the back of the Republican machine permanently in the city of Philadelphia. And what you end up with is a majority black city in a country where most black voters vote Democratic. And that's the reason why the city is overwhelmingly Democratic. And the Republicans have absolutely no control, no chance of winning an election, particularly when in my lifetime they've leaned in on the racist rhetoric, which is going to turn off the majority of voters in the city of Philadelphia.
Yep.
So that was a very long answer to a very complicated question.
I'd just like to add to our listeners that it wasn't just solely focused on Philadelphia. From 1860 until 1932, for a 72-year period, the GOP occupied the White House for 56 of those 72 years. So it wasn't just focused solely on Philadelphia. It was national.
Oh, no.
It was national.
Oh, no. There were only two Democrats elected between Lincoln's election in 1860 and FDR's election in 1832.
That's right.
One was Grover Cleveland, who up until last year was the only person elected to two non-consecutive terms, and he was an incredibly conservative Democrat, probably like almost a Republican, and Woodrow Wilson. Yeah. Who, again, only won the election because there were two Republicans running in 1912. TR, and
Taft.
Waring Harding. Taft.
Yeah.
Yeah, Taft.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, it's these very weird kind of situations that you have that, you know, Democrats get elected on the national level. Otherwise, it's Republican presidents for 70 years.
Yeah, yeah. Paul, let's talk about yourself now. Where were you born and raised?
So I grew up outside the city in Montgomery County. If you take a drive up the Northeast Extension, the first exit's a little town called Lansdale. That's where I grew up. And, you know, I went to a little college in Western New York called Alfred University. And I came back for grad school, first at Drew University, and then I finished my doctorate at Temple. So go Owls.
Where is Alfred University? I've never heard of it, Paul. Where is that? What town?
It is at the intersection of No and Where in Western New York. Basically, what you do is you drive up to Binghamton, you make a left, and you drive for 3 hours. And eventually, when the wheels have come off the car, you're in Alfred.
Okay. Paul, whenever I interview an author, I always love to ask the standard question. When you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? And of those favorite authors, did any of them light the spark inside you to become a writer or perhaps influence your writing style?
So that's a really interesting question. Early on as a kid, I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I wrote a lot as a kid. Growing up, my favorite author was the author of The Little Prince, whose name is French, and I will murder it if I try to say it. So I'm not going to do that. Just Google it. You'll find it. I also loved Jules Verne, and I read a lot of, choose your own adventure books, which I thought were great. I really loved the mechanics of that, going back, testing different things. But I also, when I got to high school, I really enjoyed history, and it helps, interest me in going and doing that when I got to college.
Okay.
And, I do think that those early experiences interested me in becoming a writer, not just becoming someone who read books, but also one who was in dialogue with them by producing them. Interestingly, though, I didn't become a novelist, so what can I say?
I think Little Prince, isn't that Antoine Saint-Exupéry?
It is, and my French is terrible, and that's why I won't embarrass myself by saying that.
Okay. Paul, big question. Please tell our listeners, where can readers find your books, and do you have a website?
I do. My website is www.paulkahan.com, and you can find them at your local bookstore. You can find them online. If you go to my website, there is a link to a non-Amazon online store. There are also, which is bookshop.org. There are also signed copies available at my local bookshop, which is Mavie Books here in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. If you happen to be in the area and you love a great bookshop, drive on out. They're a great little bookshop. We have a great coffee shop right around the corner. Great way to spend an afternoon, just checking out Ardmore.
Last question, Paul. What is your next book project, and when can we expect its release?
Oh, God help us. I am writing a biography of James Buchanan, who was the only Pennsylvanian ever elected president. And to the degree that any one man was responsible for the American Civil War, it was he. And it is going much more slowly than my editor would like. I hope tentatively that it will be out by 2029, but we will have to see.
And our only bachelor president, and until very, 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 very recent history, probably one of the worst presidents in U.S. history.
Generally regarded as such until recently.
Yes. Paul, thank you so much for appearing on the show. And let me know when it comes out. I want you on my show again.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, and may God bless and protect you always.
Same to you.
Okay, bye-bye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing author Marjorie Noble. Thank you and good night.